soup.
Hey, what's up you guys? My name's Tyler Rugge. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are talking about crested geckos, why your crested gecko isn't eating, / how to get your crested gecko to eat. So crested geckos are a wonderful pet reptile. In my opinion, they're probably one of the easiest pet reptiles you could possibly get. But an issue that a lot of first-time crested gecko keepers, including myself, run into at some point is people are either afraid their crested gecko isn't eating and it actually is and they just can't tell, or people run into the issue that their crested gecko actually isn't eating and they don't know how to get them to start eating. I wanted to go through these scenarios and just talk about different things that you can try to get your crested gecko to eat if it's not eating, but also how to tell if your crested gecko is or isn't eating if you're not seeing them eat. Now, as a lot of you know, I breed crested geckos and have over 50 of them. So I've run into all different types of issues and things with different geckos. Just every gecko is very different. That's something that you learn, and every gecko has different needs. Every gecko likes its own thing. So that's just something that you need to kind of learn and get used to. And there's just different things you need to try. And you also might be doing something wrong with your husbandry, which we're gonna get into. But before we get into all of that stuff, let's first identify whether or not your crested gecko is actually eating. First-time crested gecko keepers kind of freak out because they never see their crested gecko eating their food. However, this is completely normal because a lot of crested geckos are very secretive and they just don't like eating in front of you, really. They're also mostly active at nighttime. So usually it's at like 1 or 2 a.m. probably where they're coming out to actually eat when the lights are turned off and when you're not even in the room. Just because you don't see your crested gecko eating doesn't necessarily mean it's not eating. Kind of going along with that, try to give your crested gecko an appropriately sized food dish. On our website, celestialexotics.net, we actually sell these little gecko cups in packs of 5, free shipping, link down below if you want to check it out. But they're very useful. What's nice is you can just put a little bit of food in these. They're very shallow, easy for the gecko to get to, and you can easily see if they ate some of the food. Another thing is people often worry about placement of your food. A lot of people say that you need to keep the food on ledges. Other people will just put the food on the floor, and it really doesn't matter which one you go with. Crested geckos will eat food out of a dish on the floor. In the wild, they actually will come to the forest floor and eat fruit at the bottom of the trees. So it's not like it's unnatural for them to eat on the ground, although they do spend a lot of time up high. So it doesn't really matter where you put the dish, but some geckos I found actually prefer eating on the ground as opposed to on a ledge. So you can kind of try both too and see if there's one that your gecko seems to prefer. But another sure way to tell if your gecko is eating is when you first bring your gecko home, or really any reptile for the most part, you should be putting them straight into like a quarantine setup where it's going to be very sterile, easy to monitor them, and easy to see if they're pooping. And the way you're gonna do this is for substrate, you're just gonna use paper towels. They're really easy to just pick up and throw away and just keeps the enclosure nice and clean. And it's a lot easier to see what your gecko's poops look like and to locate the poop on paper towel as opposed to just like a dirt substrate. So make sure you're keeping your gecko on paper towel when you first get them home. Quarantine minimum 30 days. People often like to go up to 90 days. The longer you can quarantine, the better. Just to observe your gecko, make sure it's eating, pooping, looking good, and isn't having any other issues. As a general rule of thumb, if your gecko is regularly pooping, then you can be pretty sure that your gecko is also eating. Another thing that's really important to do is get a gram scale. So you're gonna wanna specifically get a scale that goes to 0.01 grams because they're a lot more accurate. Weigh your gecko regularly. This way you can actually tell if your gecko's putting on weight or if your gecko's losing weight. Whether or not you're actually worried about your gecko's eating habits, I think it's just good practice to regularly weigh your animals just so you can kind of see, because then you can catch different issues, like if they're starting to lose weight a lot sooner than you would notice them by just looking at them. And also, again, if your gecko is putting on weight, then chances are it's probably eating pretty okay. Now, of course, if you notice that your gecko isn't eating and your gecko is regularly losing weight, you're gonna wanna take your gecko probably just to the vet to make sure that there aren't any issues going on, like any sort of parasites, or really any other issues, because if your gecko has anything health-wise going on that might be making it not want to eat. Probably something you're going to want to try to catch early on so that you can start treatment right away and just get it taken care of, as opposed to waiting until it becomes a much bigger issue. So if you feel like it's your gecko's actual health at risk and it's not just some weird quirk or your husbandry issues or anything like that, I would definitely just take them straight to the vet. After you've identified whether or not for sure your gecko is or isn't eating, the next thing you want to do is obviously identify why they're not eating, or at least to the best of your abilities, identify this. And the very first thing you should probably be looking at is your husbandry, because I just see so much in gecko groups and stuff where people are like, why isn't my gecko eating? And then they show their husbandry, and it's usually that their gecko isn't properly being taken care of. Make sure your temperatures and your humidity are good, and your crested gecko enclosure, whatever room it's in, definitely should not be exceeding 80 degrees regularly. If it goes a little bit over once in a while, it's not the end of the world, but as a general rule of thumb, just under 80 degrees is where you're going to want to keep it. And your gecko isn't going to need any sort of heat source unless the enclosure regularly drops below 70 degrees. But an issue I see a lot of people doing is trying to give their crested gecko a heat source when it's just not needed, like using a heat bulb, for example. This is just really not good because it can easily burn or overheat your gecko. And if your temperature is too cold, something you can do is just add like an LED strip or a UVB bulb. Make sure you don't use a UVB bulb that's way too powerful because they don't need very much UVB. I would recommend just going for like an Arcadia Shade Dweller bulb, because if you do a small UVB bulb or an LED strip, it's going to emit a little bit of heat, but just enough to raise the enclosure temperature a couple degrees and not actually overheat it if the temperatures are just a little bit too cold. And UVB is something that some people choose to give their crested geckos, and I think it's beneficial for them. But if you're going to give your gecko UVB, again, just make sure that it's not too powerful of a UVB bulb with too much output, because that's something that can be damaging and another stressor that will cause your gecko to potentially not eat. And then as far as humidity goes, you'll usually want the humidity to be around 60%, and then misting the enclosure at night so that there's a humidity spike. And then throughout the day, the humidity will kind of go down and the enclosure will dry out a little bit, and then you can mist it again. But just as a general rule of thumb, you don't want the enclosure to be dry all the time, and you also don't want it to be overly moist and really humid all the time. Neither of those extremes are good. A little bit of fluctuation, like I said, is good. If your enclosure is too dry all the time, or if you're keeping it way too humid all the time, those are also things that could stress out a gecko, cause issues, and cause them to not eat. Another thing people often don't take into consideration is your enclosure too big? And is the enclosure too empty? These are things that can actually stress out a crested gecko, and with a lot of animals, people are striving for bigger and larger enclosures, and that's wonderful. But not all crested geckos actually do well in a large enclosure. With that being said, regardless of the size of the enclosure you're keeping, you don't want it to be too empty. So a crested gecko might do really well in a large enclosure that's full of foliage and stuff, but it also might prefer being in a little bit of a smaller enclosure with a bunch of foliage. But regardless, there should be a lot of foliage, branches, and different things for your gecko to hide in and climb on and just utilize all the space in the enclosure. Now, the biggest issue I see from a lot of people is they'll purchase a crested gecko, bring it home, and it'll be like a hatchling or like maybe a small juvenile, and they'll just immediately put it in like an 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure. And this is an issue for a lot of reasons, and I get why people do it, and they have good intentions. They want to give their gecko a nice big enclosure. But first of all, crested geckos aren't like the smartest creatures in the world. They will have issues finding their food if there's just too much space in the enclosure and too much stuff going on. If you just put a little food dish in there, sometimes they just have issues finding their food. Like, they literally need to pretty much walk across their food in order to know it's there sometimes. Like, they just aren't the brightest. And some geckos actually, I think, get stressed out if they're put in a really big enclosure. I've found, just from experience, some of our geckos have been in an 18 by 18 by 24 enclosure, and they won't eat. We try everything, take them to the vet, everything's good, they're healthy, they just won't eat. And then we tried eventually moving it down to a 12 by 12 by 18. Immediately it starts eating perfectly fine. So it's like, why were you eating in the smaller enclosure, but in the 18 by 18 by 24, you just wanted to go on a hunger strike forever? You know? It's just weird. It's something that some people experience with their crested geckos. I've known multiple people who have geckos that will eat in small enclosures and starve themselves in big enclosures. So if you're keeping your gecko in a really big enclosure, it wouldn't hurt to try downgrading them, even if it's just temporarily, to see if it gets them to start eating. And if you can get them to start eating regularly in a smaller enclosure, then maybe you can go and try to slowly move them up to a larger size and just make sure they're still eating regularly. But I don't know what it is, but some geckos just almost seem to prefer or be more comfortable in a smaller enclosure. And as far as like baby geckos go, hatchlings, just don't put them in a huge enclosure. There's no reason for it. You might think you're giving them all this space, but in reality, it's just so much more difficult to monitor them, see how their poops are doing, and just to get them to eat their food and find their prey in a huge enclosure. So typically for like a hatchling gecko, we'll keep them in a little critter keeper, which might seem really small, but again, it's what's best for the gecko. If we put crickets in there, they have no trouble finding the crickets and hunting them. They have no issue finding their food, and we can always see where they are and see their poops really easily and just monitor them. And then once we see that they're eating regularly, gaining weight, and everything looks good, then you can move them up. We'll usually move them up into a little bit bigger of a like tub setup. And just as they grow and get bigger, we slowly move them up from one size to the next, make sure they're eating, growing, everything's good. And then our adult geckos eventually end up making their way into like an 18 by 18 by 24, but it's just not something you want to just plop a small gecko in if you're having issues with them not eating and stuff, especially because it just makes things a little bit more difficult. I'm not saying, you know, don't give your gecko a nice enclosure, but some geckos just eat better in smaller enclosures. You know, I don't know. I don't make the rules. I don't know why that is. You also want to look at, is there anything else you're doing that's causing stress on the gecko? So some other things that cause stress, one is cohabbing geckos. If you're like a first-time gecko keeper, and just in general, I don't typically recommend cohabbing just because even if the geckos get along, it can cause unnecessary stress. And so if you're cohabbing geckos and you're noticing one or both of them aren't eating, definitely try separating them because they're solitary animals. They really don't need to be kept together. And it could be something like that that's stressing them out and causing them to not eat. Another thing, and this is another one I see a lot, is over handling your gecko. People kind of anthropomorphize their gecko, their animals in general. It's never a good thing, but people somehow get this impression that their gecko like loves being handled and wants to be out all the time. And even if your gecko seems to tolerate it well, really all it's doing is tolerating it. I can promise you your gecko does not find any enjoyment or fulfillment from you holding it in your hands. Just in general, if you're taking your gecko out of its enclosure like every single day and you're noticing your gecko isn't eating, then you need to try leaving the gecko in its enclosure. Try to avoid handling it unless you have to, because it could be the handling and the stress from that that's causing them to go off of food. Now, if your gecko is completely healthy, a perfect eater, and you're not having any issues, then handling them every so often isn't a big deal if your gecko seems to tolerate it. But if you're noticing your gecko's not eating, try to not handle them. When you bring your gecko home, if it doesn't eat for a few days or for a week or something, then that can be kind of normal because they get really stressed out from being transported to your house and being put in a new enclosure they're not familiar with. So just give them a little while to settle in and, you know, just get used to things, and then usually they'll start eating. You also don't want to handle it for the first week or two that it's getting settled in because again, handling just causes stress, especially if your gecko's already going through the stress of being brought home for the first time and being put in a new environment it's not familiar with. And also going along with that, having an improper photo period for them could also cause stress that makes them not want to eat. So that would be, you know, they need about 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of nighttime darkness. Just, you know, because that's the cycle of a day. Also, crested geckos are nocturnal, which means, you know, they're more active at nighttime. Usually during the day, they're away and hiding. You still want to make sure there's light in the room so they know when daytime is and that the light turns off at the same time every day, or, you know, if it's just natural sunlight, that's fine too. If you have a UVB bulb or a LED light or anything on the enclosure, make sure it's on a timer so it's turning off around the same time every day and there's just, you know, a day and night cycle. And you don't want to take your gecko out very often and handle them during the day. Try to keep that, you know, for nighttime when they're usually active, so you're not stressing them out by waking them up during the day all the time. And also try to give them their food at nighttime, since that's the time they would normally be eating. If any sort of stressful thing is happening, that could be something that's causing them to not eat. So for whatever reason, there's loud noises happening, for example, in your house, around your gecko, just regularly, that could be something that's freaking it out, causing it stress, making it not eat. Again, I feel like that might be kind of obvious, but also something you might not necessarily think of. Just try to keep your gecko in a room that's kind of quiet, doesn't get a ton of action all day when they're trying to sleep, and, you know, just try to minimize their stress overall. So once you've checked your husbandry and, you know, ruled all of those things out and decided none of those are issues, if you've ruled out any potential health issues that your gecko might have, you've taken them to the vet, all that stuff, it looks good. You've also determined that there isn't really any external things stressing your gecko out, then there might just be some little tricks that you need to try to kind of entice your gecko to eat food. So I'm going to be going over those. But first I want to talk about insects, because insects are something that can be very difficult to get a gecko to eat. And I'm talking live insects. Not all geckos have that sort of like prey drive to go and hunt live insects. Some geckos also as babies will be really good at eating insects, and then over time they'll just kind of lose the desire to hunt. By the time they're adults, they just don't eat insects anymore. And some geckos go their whole life eating insects completely fine. And if your gecko, for whatever reason, refuses to eat any live insects, that's honestly okay, as long as you're getting the insects in their diet elsewhere. And usually people do this by getting them a gecko diet that has insects in it. So there's like Pangea with insects, there's Rapashi foods with insects in it, Lagarde, all of those things we sell on our website, celestialexotics.net. We have a variety of gecko food that you can try, but make sure to get a gecko diet that has insects in it if your gecko doesn't eat live insects, because that's a good way to get it in their diet. You can also purchase cricket powder, which is literally just crickets in powder form pretty much, you know, it is what it is. And you can just mix some of that into their food, and that will, you know, add that insect into their diet. So then, getting your crested gecko to eat its crested gecko diet. So if your gecko doesn't eat insects, it's not the end of the world. It's a little annoying, but it'll survive. It'll be fine. If your gecko isn't eating its crested gecko diet, this is like the most frustrating thing ever, because the crested gecko diet is like the most important part, you know? Like, your gecko can't just survive on insects. Maybe it could, but it probably wouldn't be the best for it. So here are some tricks. First one is try different flavors, because believe it or not, some geckos will prefer certain flavors over others. Some geckos are like, you know what, I hate papaya. I'm only going to eat the fig, you know, like it's just weird. They prefer different flavors. So try the different flavors and also try different brands. I would just recommend getting the little like 2-ounce bags of gecko food so you can try different things. You can also try mixing different flavors together. If you go to celestialexotics.net, you can choose from Rapashi, Lagarde, Pangea. We have the small sizes of everything. We have a ton of flavors available and free shipping. Another thing is play around with the consistency, because some geckos also prefer their diet to be a certain consistency, and sometimes if you just don't get the consistency right, they won't eat it. Try mixing in bee pollen powder. I don't know what it is, but they just love the way it tastes. very last thing that I would possibly recommend doing is trying to hand feed your gecko. This is something that I would do if you've tried everything else. It's like your last resort and you've went to the vet and your gecko's not sick and whatever. And if you hand feed your gecko and that's the absolute only way you can get it to eat and it's like losing weight otherwise, then I would recommend hand feeding. But the reason I say hand feeding as like a last resort is because yes, some geckos you can get them to eat via hand feeding, but it's extremely annoying when a gecko will rely on you to hand feed it, otherwise it won't eat. And I can guarantee you, you don't want to sit there every night probably trying to hand feed your gecko because it's just going to get old after a while. And you just don't want to get your gecko in that habit. Now, I do hand feed geckos for fun every once in a while just because they're really cute. I only do this with geckos that are really good and reliable eaters, and I know that they don't care whether or not I hand feed them, like they're gonna eat either way. But if your gecko's extremely picky and you just get them used to hand feeding, then it gets really annoying. But if it's something that you feel like you have to do and it's like you've tried everything else, then by all means, don't just let your gecko starve itself to death. And hopefully you can get them from hand feeding to getting them to eat out of a dish, but I just wouldn't get them in the habit of that right away. You definitely should be checking all of the other factors and trying other things first. And if all else fails, I don't know what to tell you. Like I said, I think the biggest things are just people either thinking their gecko's not eating when it actually is, or it's usually some sort of husbandry issue, or of course it could be a health issue that needs to be seen by a vet. But yeah, I hope you guys found this video to be helpful. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Make sure to check out our website, once again, celestialexotics.net, because we have gecko food, hides, dishes, just all kinds of stuff, cute stickers. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. I'm at the age where when I sit down for too long, my legs stop working. Ow. I can't stand up.